Human history begins in slow motion, a patient accumulation of small changes that together reshape the world. The earliest chapters are not about empires, or battles, or written laws. They are about hands and flame, about the first people who learned to shape stone with purpose and to hold a spark long enough to banish cold and night. For hundreds of thousands of years, bands of hunter-gatherers moved across landscapes, following herds, reading the weather, learning which plants would nourish and which would poison. Those small, ingenious acts, the flaking of a cutting edge, the careful removal of a spear tip, the shared warmth around a communal fire rewired what it meant to be human. Tool-making demanded planning, passing skills across generations. Caring for the young and the elderly required cooperative labor. And the stories told by the fire hardened into ritual and memory. These bits of culture were the first infrastructure of civilization. By the time groups began to plant wild seeds and encourage desirable traits in plants and animals, the world had already been shaped by countless small hands. The transition to agriculture was not a single revolution, but a long, uneven process that took different shapes in different places. In the fertile river valleys of the Near East, people learned to sow emmer and einkorn wheat. In East Asia, rice cultivation emerged in wet lowlands. In the Americas, maize and beans became staples adapted to many climates. In Africa, sorghum and millet supported expanding populations. With the domestication of plants came the domestication of labor. Settled villages grew. Seasonal cycles became centers of planning, and the gathering of surpluses allowed some people to specialize as potters, weavers, priests, and chiefs. The first cities grew out of these webs of surplus and specialization. Early cities were nodes and networks. Trade corridors linked obsidian, copper, shells, and salt across hundreds of miles. Towns like Jericho and Cataluyuk slid into urban rhythms. Larger city-states such as Uruk in Mesopotamia and the cities along the Nile developed bureaucracies, monumental architecture, and written records. Writing itself was born as a bookkeeping technology, tokens, marks, and later cuneiform and hieroglyphs, which allowed courts and temples to track grain, tribute, and workers. Those records produced histories and laws. They also made it possible to organize labor on a scale never before imagined. Ziggurats rose toward the sky, tombs were filled with goods meant for another life, and palaces concentrated wealth and force. With concentrated wealth came concentrated violence. Bronze metallurgy brought a new instrumentality to war. Chariots propelled by spoked wheels transformed battlefield dynamics. Bronze swords and spears changed the calculus of cavalry and shield walls. Complex states emerged, and with them the need to defend territory, control trade routes, and manage tribute. The earliest empires, Sumerian, Akkadian, Egyptian, were experiments in large-scale control. They required logistics, taxation, and propaganda. Kings declared themselves mediators between gods and people, thereby justifying their control of resources and labor. Those who controlled irrigation and grain storage commanded the lifeblood of urban centers. Trade spread ideas as much as goods. The exchange of metal, timber, and textiles carried motifs, religious rituals, and technological know-how. Empires dipped and surged. Climate stress, overextension, or waves of migration could topple palaces. The collapse cycles of the Bronze Age in the eastern Mediterranean around the late 2nd millennium BCE shattered long-distance trade for a time, causing states to fragment and new polities to emerge from the ruins. Yet that fragmentation did not mean a return to primitiveness. New social formations formed, fresh identities and cultural practices flowered, and ironworking gradually diffused, giving even smaller kingdoms access to strong tools and weapons. Meanwhile, in regions often left out of classical Western narratives, complex societies rose along rivers and coasts. The Indus Valley cities Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa boasted planned streets and sanitation centuries before many parts of Europe, while East Asian civilization took root along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, evolving distinctive agricultural cycles and political philosophies. In the Americas, long urban traditions developed independently, complex, city-centered societies harnessed diverse biomes and built monumental architecture in stone and earth. Sub-Saharan Africa knit regional networks through trans-Saharan caravan routes, while states like Nubia and later Ghana and Mali managed long-distance trade in gold, salt, and scholars. Human societies multiplied the ways to be successful. The first millennia BCE were an explosion of intellectual and spiritual ferment. Across Eurasia, people organized cosmic and social orders. The early forms of Hindu thought matured in the Indian subcontinent. Buddhism emerged as a reformist spiritual path. Confucian and Taoist schools mapped social duties and natural harmony in China, and the Greek polis gave rise to philosophers who sought to define justice, ethics, and the good life. The emergence of script and literate bureaucracies allowed complex states, burghs, satrapies, Rome's legions, and roads to administer populations across vast distances. Empire, at its best, offered order and shared infrastructure. At its worst, it imposed extraction and cultural erasure. Rome built roads and law. Qing and Mughal dynasties linked vibrant markets and artistic courts. Cities became platforms for exchange of people, ideas, and power. War was never simply a clash of armies. It was a driver of innovation in logistics, in engineering, and in state formation. The need to feed armies stabilized supply chains. Siegecraft pushed masonry and metallurgy. Naval power mobilized shipbuilding and astronomy. Conquest reshaped cultural geographies. Alexander's campaigns fused Greek styles into the cities of Central Asia. Roman governance spread legal ideas and architecture. The Arabs' expansion after the 7th century carried a linguistic, religious, and scientific revolution across a vast zone from Spain to Sind. The Silk Road strings of trade routes across Eurasia bound together economies and cultures, moving silk, precious metals, spices, ideas, and even diseases. Disease, in turn, was an unpredictable agent of transformation. Epidemics could hollow out regions, collapse labor forces, and invert social orders. The Justinian Plague and later, the Black Death remade economic and political relationships between labor and land, accelerating social mobility in some contexts and collapse in others. Yet human societies adapted. New agricultural techniques, reorganized labor patterns, and shifts in political authority emerged in response. By the 2nd millennium CE, the world had fully entered an age of empires and interconnection. Islam nurtured centers of learning in Baghdad and Cordoba. The Tang and Song dynasties in East Asia cultivated technological innovation, printing, and commercial networks. In West Africa, urban centers like Timbuktu became nodes in intellectual and commercial exchange. Long-distance connections remained uneven, but no place was fully isolated. Mariners charted coasts, caravans traced desert lines, and merchants stitched together markets. These connections fed not only wealth, but also the exchange of religious movements, legal systems, and technological primitives that would seed later transformations. Part 1 ends with a simple lesson. History's deep patterns are made of ordinary human acts: planting, mending, bargaining. Cities and empires are their accumulations. When those patterns break through climate, plague, war, it is not always catastrophe alone that follows. Societies reconfigure, sometimes spawning innovations that set new trajectories. The world that emerges from these long centuries will soon be transformed again, as ocean crossings and gunpowder set the stage for a global age of exchange, conquest, and catastrophic consequence. But before the oceans are crossed, these foundations of agriculture, craft, religion, and statecraft will determine who has the tools to govern, to fight, and to survive. When Europeans in the 15th and 16th centuries set sail beyond familiar horizons, they stepped into a world already shaped by millennia of cross-cultural contact. The voyages of Columbus, da Gama, and Magellan are often framed as bold acts of discovery. But discovery was a function of longer histories of navigational developments, of the spread of maritime technologies, like the Latin sail and the astrolabe, and of long-standing trade pressures that pushed states to seek new supplies. Western Europe was not the first maritime power, yet the political fragmentation of late medieval Europe, coupled with profitable state rivalries and an appetite for spices and silver, generated the conditions for oceanic expansion. The consequences were sweeping and immediate. European ships bore crew, missionaries, traders, and diseases that devastated indigenous populations of the Americas. Cantinas and plazas were replaced by colonial capitals. The landscapes of the Americas were remade by crops, livestock, and forced labor systems. For the economies of Europe, the influx of silver and sugar wealth financed dynastic wars and the expansion of commercial capitalism. The transatlantic slave trade became an integral, horrific component of this system, forcibly relocating millions of Africans to labor on plantations across the Americas. The ecological consequences: New World crops spreading to Asia and Africa. Old World livestock transforming ecosystems, reconfigured diets and demographics globally. Concomitantly, empires rose and fell across Afro-Eurasia. The Mongol conquest opened routes and, for a time, ensured relative safety along trade corridors that enabled merchants and scholars to circulate across unprecedented distances. In South Asia, Mughal courts patronized art and new administrative centers. In East Asia, Ming and then Qing dynasties consolidated centralized bureaucratic states overseen by scholar-official elites. In the Islamic world, the Ottoman Empire knitted together Anatolia, the Levant, and much of North Africa into a powerful polity that managed trade routes and religious authority. The early modern era also saw the rise of technological and administrative capacities that would ultimately accelerate state power. Gunpowder began to refashion warfare and siegecraft. Printing spread information faster than ever before. Maps got better. These tools allowed for more centralized administration, more ambitious military campaigns, and eventually a capacity for empire building on a planetary scale. But these centuries were also marked by philosophical upheaval. The Renaissance and subsequent European intellectual movements rediscovered classical texts and refashioned knowledge. The scientific revolution challenged received authorities and birthed methods of observation and experimental testing that would gradually build the body of modern science. Political thinkers debated the nature of sovereignty and rights. Debates later translated into political upheavals, most notably the American and French revolutions reshaped conceptions of legitimacy and citizenship. The moral contradictions of slavery and empire started to be exposed by activists and thinkers. Abolitionist movements eventually grew powerful in the 19th century, though the legacies of enslavement would persist. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain, was a rupture of another kind. Machines replaced hand labor in factories. Steam power unlocked unprecedented energy to move goods and people. Railroads and steamships redefined time and space. Cities ballooned as people left rural life for wage labor. The transformation brought enormous wealth to some, abject poverty to others, and brutal working conditions that sparked new political ideologies: socialism, anarchism, labor organization that sought to redress industrial inequality. It also provided the means for imperial extraction to intensify. Industrial states sought raw materials and markets and used military force and diplomatic pressure to secure them. The 19th century's geopolitical map was dominated by industrializing European empires, the rising United States, and modernizing Asian powers. The British Empire spread across continents. Russia expanded eastward into Siberia and into Central Asia. Japan underwent a cataclysmic modernization after 1868's Meiji Restoration and would soon join the Great Power Club. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century carved the continent into colonies, often with little regard for pre-existing polities. These imperial intrusions remade economies, social hierarchies, and borders, often with long-term violent consequences. Cultural and intellectual life also grew more global. The telegraph, the railroad, and press networks connected distant metropoles. New movements: nationalism, liberalism, and nascent feminism reshaped societies. The clash of these forces would culminate in the 20th century's world-shattering wars. Part 2 closes by asking a hard question: if the early modern era made the world more connected, did it make it more humane? The same technologies that knit the globe together also enabled extraction and domination on a scale previously impossible. The moral debts of the age enslavement, dispossession, cultural erasure would not be easily paid, and the world would soon step into conflicts that push modernity as possibilities toward either liberation or annihilation. The 20th century began under the blaze of technological optimism. Cars, radios, and flight imagined a modern life of mobility. But beneath the gleam were tensions generated by imperial rivalries, industrial militarization, and explosive nationalisms. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, was a rupture. Millions of soldiers died in mechanized slaughter across trenches that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. The war's unprecedented carnage yielded collapsed dynasties, the redrawing of maps, and bitter social aftershocks. The interwar period was a dangerous crucible. Economic crisis, most notably the Great Depression of the 1930s, devastated livelihoods and amplified radical political movements. Totalitarian ideologies: fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, militant nationalism in Japan found mass appeal among those who demanded strong order, territory, and revival. Meanwhile, Soviet communism represented a competing vision of state-directed modernization, often enforced through brutal coercion. The competition between these models pushed the world toward a second, even more catastrophic conflict. World War II 1939 to 1945 blended total mobilization with technological escalation and genocidal ideology. Cities were bombed, industrial complexes were retooled for war. Whole populations were moved to produce arms and food. The war combined conventional battles with ideological extermination. The Holocaust remains a moral abyss, an industrialized attempt to annihilate whole peoples. In the Pacific, brutal island campaigns and massive airstrikes produced horrors that matched Europe's darkest violences. Yet the war also produced alliances that defeated fascism and produced new projections of international order. When the war ended, the international system split into two antagonistic blocs. The United States emerged as a military and economic superpower, possessing a nuclear monopoly that reshaped geopolitics. The Soviet Union claimed the mantle of revolutionary socialism and consolidated control over Eastern Europe. The Cold War that followed would last decades, manifesting through proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, through arms races, and through ideological competition in the global South. At the same time, the imperial system that had dominated the 19th century was collapsing. Independence movements surged across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. India, Indonesia, and numerous African nations won formal sovereignty, though post-colonial realities included often exploitative economic relations and internal conflicts that traced to colonial borders. The post-war era also produced new institutions: the United Nations, Bretton Woods financial architecture, and later an array of development agencies intended to manage conflict and rebuild economies, with varying success. Technological transformations accelerated in the second half of the century: jet travel, nuclear power, antibiotics, semiconductor electronics, and, finally, the digital revolution restructured economies and everyday life. The Green Revolution dramatically increased agricultural yields and fed billions, while space flight expanded human horizons to orbit and beyond. Social movements: civil rights in the United States, decolonization, feminism's second wave, and environmentalism challenged entrenched injustices and changed public life and law. Yet the late 20th century also revealed new vulnerabilities. Ecological degradation accelerated. Industrial waste, deforestation, and fossil fuel combustion began to show global climate effects. Inequality persisted and sometimes widened, even as global poverty rates shifted in complex ways. Competition shifted too. In 1991, the Soviet Union's collapse removed a bipolar structure, leaving the United States a dominant power but not rendering the world peaceful. Ethnic conflicts, civil wars, and the emergence of non-state violent actors continued to make the world insecure. Part 3 ends with a sense that the modern project had produced extraordinary gains: longer lives, wider education, unprecedented material comforts alongside deeper risks, technology that could destroy as easily as it healed, and global ecological pressures that now demanded collective responses. The 21st century began with these dual inheritances: optimism about connectivity and innovation, worrying about planetary limits and political fragmentation, globalization, fractures, and the digital age. The late 20th and early 21st centuries fused markets, cultures, and technologies into an integration of unprecedented scale. Trade liberalization, container shipping, and communications technologies enabled capital and commodities to move rapidly across borders. Multinational corporations grew more powerful than many states. Global supply chains knitted together factories from East Asia to Central Europe. This hyperconnectivity produced enormous prosperity for some while producing dislocation for many. Manufacturing jobs shifted to lower-wage regions, urbanization accelerated, and political loyalties changed in response. Digital technologies transformed not just commerce but social life. The Internet, originally a research network, proliferated into social media platforms that altered how people formed communities, consumed information, and organized politically. Instant communication strengthened social movements, but also accelerated the speed of rumor and manipulation. Data became an economic resource, and questions about privacy, surveillance, and algorithmic bias surfaced amid triumphalist accounts of progress. Geopolitically, the world grew multipolar. China's rapid economic rise reconfigured Asian trade and politics. The European Union sought deeper integration even as it faced crises. The United States remained powerful but faced internal political polarization and new external competitors. Regional conflicts from the Balkans to the Middle East combined with global terrorism to produce irregular wars and humanitarian emergencies. Climate change emerged as an existential concern. Rising seas, shifting rainfall patterns, and more extreme weather threatened food security and compelled migration pressures that tested political institutions. Economic inequality remained a central fault line. Global GDP growth did not mean universal well-being. Many regions and social groups were marginalized. Populist politics left and right exploited economic discontent and cultural anxieties, challenging established parties and institutions. Simultaneously, movements for gender equality, racial justice, and indigenous rights advanced policy and cultural change in many contexts. Science advanced apace. Genomic sequencing opened the doors to personalized medicine, CRISPR gene editing raised ethical questions, and renewable energy technologies promised a pathway away from fossil fuels. Yet the social governance of these technologies lagged. Ethical frameworks for AI, equitable distribution for vaccines, and global coordination on climate targets all proved politically fraught. Culturally, the era was marked by dizzying flows. People migrated in huge numbers pushed by conflict, climate, or economic opportunity, embedding diasporas worldwide. Cities became fluxed with new languages and cuisines. Hybrid cultures formed. Global media created shared reference points: films, music, streaming series that transcended borders, even as local traditions persisted and adapted. Part 4 closes on a paradox. The world had never been more connected, yet political life often retreated into fragmentation. The tools to solve planetary problems, scientific knowledge, real-time communication, economic resources existed. So, too did the incentives to delay or deflect collective action. The story of the present decade will be whether human institutions adapt fast enough to use these tools for survival and justice. Choices ahead, risks, remedies, and a shared future: the arc of human history is neither inevitably progressive nor set on a single trajectory. It is instead an evolving conversation between improvisation and structure, between courage and cruelty, between local rootedness and global entanglement. The modern world, with its astonishing productive capacities, faces problems that are planetary in scale, climate change foremost among them, but also epical opportunities. The ability to eradicate certain diseases, to produce plenty for far larger populations, and to design technologies that expand human creativity and knowledge. Confronting climate change demands systemic shifts. Energy systems, urban planning, agriculture, and consumption patterns all must change. Technology alone will not suffice. Governance structures that distribute costs and benefits fairly are essential. This means international cooperation at levels not yet achieved, as well as robust domestic institutions that can legislate, regulate, and support transitions for workers and communities. History teaches that just transitions succeed when they are politically legitimate, when affected communities are engaged, compensated, and offered alternatives. Technology and ethics intersect in the challenge of artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and surveillance. AI can enhance medical diagnostics, climate modeling, and logistics, but without transparent governance and public accountability, it can entrench bias or facilitate repression. Gene editing may cure disease, but also raise questions about equitable access and unintended ecological consequences. The lesson here is ancient. Tools are double-edged. Their societal impact depends on how they are embedded in law, ethics, and social priorities. Political fragmentation and identity politics also press on democratic institutions. Inequality and perceived exclusion can erode legitimacy and fuel authoritarian tendencies. Strengthening institutions requires not only policy, but civic cultivation, education, media literacy, and spaces for cross-cultural dialogue. The history of the modern era suggests that inclusive political orders are more resilient when they foster participation and when economic gains are seen to be broadly shared. There is also the imperative to reckon with historical injustices. Slavery, colonialism, and systems of dispossession created wealth for some and catastrophic loss for others. Many societies are now confronting these legacies through truth commissions, reparative policies, and public memory projects. These efforts rarely offer tidy accounting, but can help mend social fabric when undertaken transparently and sincerely. Economically, the middle decades of the 21st century will be shaped by automation, shifting demographics, and the geography of innovation. Aging populations in parts of the world will stretch healthcare and pension systems, while younger demographics in others will require jobs and education. Migration pressures, partly climate-driven, will reshape politics and urban landscapes. The wise management of these transitions requires foresight, institutions that plan for decades, not quarters. Culture and imagination will matter as much as policy. Narratives that connect personal meaning to common purpose, stories of stewardship, of mutual aid, of cosmopolitan belonging will make collective action possible. Art, ritual, and narrative have always been mechanisms for forging solidarity. They will be indispensable as the world navigates scarcity, transformation, and the need to reconcile competing claims. Finally, the long sweep of history offers both comfort and warning. Human beings have repeatedly adapted, forming cooperative institutions, inventing technologies, and reconfiguring economies in response to crises. But adaptation is costly, politically fraught, and unequal. The choices ahead about energy, governance, technology, and justice will determine whether the next centuries are ones of catastrophic failure or renewed flourishing. History is not over. It is a living conversation in which every community, scientist, artist, and worker participates. We cannot rerun the past, but we can learn from it about humility and power, about the danger of concentration, about the possibilities of solidarity. If this sweeping panorama from Stone Age hearths to satellites moved you, support History of Wars by subscribing for more documentaries, that explore how conflict, innovation, and human courage have shaped our planet. Like, comment, and tell us which chapter of the past you want next, because the story continues, and every voice helps write the next page.